Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing our series on Ralph Waldo Emerson's journals. We are up to journal collection number 28, which covers the year 1837 when the author is 34 years old. We are now up to August of that year, specifically August 18th. And with that said, I will go ahead and start by reading that passage. August 18th. The hope to arouse young men at Cambridge to a worthier view of their literary duties prompts me to offer the theory of the scholar's function. He has an office to perform in society. What is it? To arouse the intellect, to keep it erect and sound, to keep admiration in the hearts of the people, to keep the eye open upon its spiritual aims. How shall he render this service? By being a soul among those things which he deals. Let us look at the world as it aids his function. One thing is plain, he must have a training by himself. The training of another age will not fit him. He himself, and not others, must judge what is good for him. Now the young are oppressed by their instructors. Bacon or Locke saw and thought and inspired by their thinking a generation, and now all must be pinned to their thinking, which a year after was already too narrow for them. The coverlet is too narrow and too short. They were born heirs of the dome of God, thereunder or therein to move unshackled and unbounded, and we would confine them under a coverlet. Meek young men grow up in colleges, and believe it is their duty to accept the views which books have given, and grow up slaves. Some good angel in the shape of a turnkey bids them demand a habeas corpus, and the moment they come out of durance, the heaven opens and the earth smiles. They say the insane like a master, so always does the human heart hunger after a leader, a master through truth. August 19th. The secret of the scholar or intellectual man is that all nature is only the foliage, the flowering and the fruit of the soul, and that every part therefore exists as emblem and sign of some fact in the soul. Instantly rags and offal are elevated into hieroglyphics. As the chemist sees nothing unclean, so the poet does not. This needed the reflective age. The near explains the far. A drop of water tells all that is true of the ocean. A family will reveal the state, and one man the all. The reflective age should make the greatest discoveries. Let me once go behind any material fact and see its cause, an affection, an idea, and the fact assumes at once a scientific value. Facts are disagreeable or loathsome to me so long as I have no clue to them. Persons are formidable or tedious. But give me the chain that connects them to the universal consciousness, and I shall see them to be necessary and see them to be convenient, and enlarge my charity one circle more, and let them in. Let me see how the man not, quote, is tyrannized over by his members, quote, but by his thoughts, and these thoughts of mine, thoughts that I have also, though qualified in me by other thoughts not yet ripened in him, and I can pardon and rejoice in him also. Community, identity of nature, is the ground of that boundless trust in men which always has its reward in reciprocal trust. I please myself with getting my nail-box set in the snuggest corner of the barn chamber, and well filled with nails and gimlets, pincers, screwdriver, and chisel. Herein I find an old joy of youth, of childhood, which perhaps all domestic children share, the cat-like love of garrets, barns, and corn chambers, and of the conveniences of long housekeeping. It is quite genuine. When it occurs today, I ask, have others the same? Once I should not have thought of such a question. What I loved, I supposed all children loved and knew, and therefore I did not name them. We were at accord. But much conversation, much comparison apprises us of difference. The first effect of this new learning is to decline us to hide our tastes. As they differ, we must be wrong. Afterward, some person comes and wins eclat by simply describing this old but concealed fancy of ours. Then we immediately learn to value all the parts of our nature, to rely on them as self-authorized, and that to publish them is to please others. So now the nail box figures for its value in my journal. We are indeed discriminated from each other by very slight inequalities, which, by their accumulation, constitute at last broad contrasts. Genius surprises us with every word. It does not surprise itself. It is moving by the self-same law as you obey in your daily cogitation, and one day you will tread without wonder the same steps. Plutarch, and a short insertion from the editor. Here follow many quotations from Plutarch's Morals, many of them quoted by him from the poets. A few are here given. Quote, Hesiod says, Bad counsel, so the gods ordain, is most of all the adviser's bane. Morals, Vol.4, page 158. Quote, They should have left every one in those sentiments which they had from the laws and customs concerning the divinity, since neither now nor yesterday began these thoughts that have been ever, nor yet can a man be found who their first entrance knew. Morals, Volume 4, page 391, from Sophocles' Antigone. Quote, Dost thou behold the vast and azure sky, how in its liquid arms the earth doth lie? Morals, Volume 4, page 320. Quote, Truth being the greatest good that man can receive, and the godliest blessing that God can give. Morals, Volume 4, page 60. Quote, Nature sent us out free and loose. We bind and straighten and pin up ourselves in houses and reduce ourselves to a scant and little room. Morals, Volume 3, page 50. Quote, Stern Jove has in some angry mood bereft us of his solitude. Telemachus and Homer, Apud Plutarch, Morals, Volume 3, page 73. Quote, Unvanquished love, whatever else deceives our trust, 'tis this our very selves outlives. Morals, Volume 3, page 74. Quote, It is an expression of Pindar that we tread the dark bottom of hell with necessities as hard as iron. Morals, Volume 1, page 288. After a festival you may see, quote, the dirt of wine. Quote, The sea was the tear of Saturn. Quote, A walk near the sea and a sail near the shore are best. August 20th. Carlyle and Wordsworth now act of England on us. Coleridge also. Lydian remembers the religious terrors of her childhood, when young tinged her day and night thoughts, and the doubts of Cowper were her own, when every lightning seemed the beginning of conflagration, and every noise in the street the crack of doom. I have some parallel recollections at the Latin school when I lived in Beacon Street. Afterwards, what remained for one to learn was cleansed by books, and poetry, and philosophy, and came in purer forms of literature at college. These spiritual crises no doubt are periods of as certain occurrence in some form of agitation to every mind as dentition or puberty. Lydian was at that time alarmed by the lines on the gravestones. The babe cheers me with his hearty and protracted laugh, which sounds to me like the thunder in the woods. August 21st. A dream of a duel. Dreams may explain the magnetic directed dream. Dreams are the sequel of waking knowledge. Awake, I know the character of Andrew, but do not think what he may do. We say paradise was. Adam fell, the golden age, and the like. We mean man is not as he ought to be, but our way of painting this is on time, and we say was. August 22nd. I received this morning The French Revolution, a History by Thomas Carlyle from him. Editor's insertion. On the last day of August, Mr. Emerson delivered the address before the Phi Beta Kappa Society, the American Scholar. September 6th. Not a word is inscribed for 10 days, and now we bask in warm and yellow light of 3 pearly days. Corn, beans, and squashes ripen every hour. The garden, the field, an Indian paradise. It seemed the other day a fact of some moment that the project of our companion, be he who he may, and that what it may, is always entitled in courteous society to deference and superiority. September 13th. We need nature, and cities give us the human sense do not room enough. I go out daily and nightly to feed my eyes on the horizon and the sky, and come to feel that want of this scope as I do of water for my washing. Yesterday, as I watched the flight of some crows, I suddenly discovered a hawk high overhead, and then directly 4 others at such a height they seemed small as sparrows. There on high they swooped and circled in the pure heaven. After watching them for a time, I turned my eye to my path and was struck with the dim and leaden color, all unattractive and shorn of beams of this earth to him whose eye has conversed with heaven. Today I wrote a letter to Carlyle. On the 1st of September, the club spent the day with me. Present, Alcott, Barlow, Bradford, Clark, Dwight, Emerson, Francis, Hedge, Osgood, Peabody, Putnam, Ripley, Robbins, Stetson, Elizabeth Hoare, Mrs. Ripley, and Margaret Fuller also honored our seance. The American artist who could carve a wood god and who was familiar with the forest in Maine, where enormous fallen pine trees cumber the forest floor, where huge mosses depending from the trees and masts of the timber give a savage and haggard strength to the grove, would produce a very different statue from the sculptor who only knew a European woodland, the tasteful Greek, for example. The German printed type resembles the Gothic architecture. It occurred the other day, in hearing some clapping of hands after his speech, that the orator's value might be measured by every additional round after the first 3 claps, just as jockeys are wont to pay $10 for every additional roll of a horse who rolls himself on the ground. For in both cases the first and second roll come very easily off, but it gets beyond the third very hardly. September 18th. In the woods today I heard a pattering like rain, and looking up I beheld the air over and about the trees full of insects, the winged ant, and in violent motion and gyrations, and some of them continually dropping out of the flying or fighting swarm, and causing the rain-like sound as they fell upon the oak leaves. The fallers consisted of little knots of 2 or 3 insects apparently biting each other, and so twisting or holding together as to encumber the wings. September 19th. There are few experiences in common life more mortifying and disagreeable than, quote, the foolish face of praise, unquote. I should like very well to get the data of the good story which Lydian tells of the stout soldier who persisted in wearing his military queue when the reforming major ordered all queues to be cut off in the regiment. The soldier held fast to his own, and, dying, required that a hole should be made underneath his head in his coffin, and the dear queue should project, decent and honorable, thereout. Charles, talking of Mrs. Blank, said that she had 2 faces, and when conversing with her you looked up and would suddenly find that instead of talking with the beautiful Mrs. Blank, you were talking with a ghoul. The hand is needed to teach the use of the eye. We can hardly speak of our own experience and the names of our family sparingly enough. The rule seems to be that we should not use these dangerous personalities any more than we are sure the sympathies of the interlocutors will go along with us. The Aesthetic Club met at Mr. Clark's in Newton on September 6th. Present, Alcott, Clark, Dwight, Emerson, Francis, Hedge, Osgood, Ripley, Stetson, Miss Clark, Miss Fuller, and Miss Peabody were also present. Our spontaneous action is always our best. Come out of the study and walk abroad, and you shall get suddenly a spontaneous glance of the soul at your subject, more searching and just than any the hours of labor had given. Yet was the labor a needful preamble. So the first retrospect on yesterday's thought, which we have on waking, mark, keep, and deepen that. I have among my kinsmen a man to whom, more than anyone I have known, I may apply the phrase, an afternoon man. He rolls and riots and delays. His wife and daughters beseech him to plant his corn early, that it may not be killed by frost as it was last year. Pooh, he says, I hate to have all the corn ripe. I like to see some of it cut in the stalk for fodder. The horse I bought of him was very small. Oh yes, he says, none of those great overgrown creatures that eat all before them. Mr. Lamb complained of the very bad roads in Maine, which had racked his chaise badly. Why, Mr. Lamb, said my friend, I always think that does a chaise good to come down into his country. It drives in the spokes of the wheels and makes it all tight and strong. On the 29th of August, I received a letter from the Salem Lyceum, signed I. F. Worcester, requesting me to lecture before the institution next winter, and adding, quote, the subject is, of course, discretionary with yourself, provided no allusions are made to religious controversy or other exciting topics upon which the public mind is honestly divided, end quote. I replied on the same day to Mr. W. by quoting these words and adding, I am really sorry that any person in Salem should think me capable of accepting an invitation so encumbered. Quote, the motto on all palace gates is, Hush, end quote. Lady Louisa Stuart, Anecdotes of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Mr. Lee said, quote, Miss Fuller remembers. It is very ill-bred to remember, end quote. Nothing is more carefully secured in our Constitution than that we shall not systematize or integrate too fast. Carry it how we will, always something refuses to be subordinated into drill. It will not toe the line. The facts of animal magnetism are now extravagant. We can make nothing of them. What then? Why, own that you are a tyro. We make a dear little cosmogony of our own that makes the world, and tucks in all nations like cherries into tart, and 'tis all finished and rounded into compass and shape, but unluckily we find that it will not explain the existence of the African race. It was the happiest turn to my old thrum which Charles Henry Warren gave us a toast at the, and then there's three Greek letters, dinner. Mr. President, he said, I suppose all know where the orator comes from, and I suppose all know what he has said. I give you the spirit of concord. It makes us all of one mind. That a man appears scornful and claims to belong to another age and race is only affirmation of weakness. A true man belongs to no other time or place, but is the center of things. He measures you and all men and all events. You are constrained to accept his standard. Lydian's Aunt Sarah Cotton, when washing clothes with her sisters, was addressed by her father, who passed through the kitchen. Girls, who saw that you now would think the descendants of Robert Bruce? Father, said she, if I knew in which of my veins his blood flowed, I would instantly let it out into the wash-tub. September 20th. I read this morning some lines written by Mr. Alston to Mr. Jameson on the Diary of an Ennui. Very good and entirely self-taught, original, not conventional. And always we hear a sublime admonition in any such line. But the verses celebrate Italy, not as it is, but as it is imagined. That earth, quote, fills her lap with pleasures not her own, end quote, but supplied from self-deceived imaginations. I must think the man is not yet married to nature who sighs ever for some foreign land. Italy can never show me a better earth and heaven than the many a time I have intoxicated my senses within a mile of my house. Then I must think the man is not yet ripe, who is not yet domesticated in his native spot, who has not yet domesticated art and nature, grandeur and beauty, hope and fear, friendship, angels, and God, and the chamber where he sits, and the half-acre where his chimney rises. The passion for traveling is a mark of our age and of this country, and indicates youth, novitiate, and not yet the reign of heroic instincts. It is like the conjugating French verbs, which has in some families been called education. Some people are curious about relics, Shakespeare's Mulberry, and the houses in which Milton lived, about removing from city to city or country to country the remains of a dead friend. He who has indeed a friend, who has found a unity of consciousness with his brother, and seeing into the glorious goal of right and great with him, will think little of bringing home his shoes or body. September 21st. The autumnal equinox comes with sparkling stars and thoughtful days. I think the principle of the peace party sublime, and that the opposers of this philanthropy do not sufficiently consider the positive side of the spiritualist, but only see his negative or abstaining side. But if a nation of men is exalted to that height of morals as to refuse to fight and choose rather to suffer loss of goods and loss of life than to use violence, they must not be helpless, but most effective and great men. They would overawe their invader and make him ridiculous. They would communicate the contagion of their virtue and inoculate all mankind. September 23rd. I wrote long since thus. When phrenology came, men listened with alarm to the adept, who seemed to insinuate with knowing looks that they had let out their secret, that, maugre themselves, he was reading them to the bone and marrow. They were presently comforted by learning that their human incognito would be indulged to them a short time longer, until the artists had settled what allowance was to be made for temperament, and what for counteracting organs, which trifling circumstances hindered the most exact observation from being of any value. September 28th. I hope New England will come to boast itself in being a nation of servants, and leave to the planters the misery of being a nation of served. September 30th. The child delights in shadows on the wall. The child prattles in the house, but if you carry him out of doors, he is overpowered by the light and extent of natural objects, and is silent. But there never was a child so lovely, but his mother was glad to get him asleep. I get no further than my old doctrine that the whole is in each man, and that a man may, if he will, as truly and fully illustrate the laws of nature in his own experience as in the history of Rome or Palestine or England. A great deal of pregnant business is done daily before our eyes, for which we take very little note. Sift, for instance, what people say in reference to property, when the character of any man is considered. It will appear that it is an essential element to our knowledge of man what was his opinion, practice, and success in regard to the institution of property. It tells a great deal of his spiritual history, this part. He was no whole man until he knew how to earn a blameless livelihood. Society is barbarous until every industrious man can get his living without dishonest customs. When Eli Robbins insists that rules of trade apply to clergy as well as shopkeepers, he means no insult, but a recognition only that there is a just law of humanity now hid under the canting of society. October 1st. I thought again today how much it needs to preach the doctrine of being against seeming, especially to young women, the tendency of example, of precept, of constitution, and of their first experience is almost irresistible in favor of preferring appearances. Let them know that, whatever they may think they know to the contrary, it is not the pretty form, face, or fair or hair that wins, much less the skill of dress, but that faces are but urns into which they may infuse an inexpressible loveliness, and that everything they do, every noble choice they make, every forbearance, every virtue beautifies them with a charm to all beholders. Let them know that as God liveth, they that be shall have, and not they that seem. One class wins, now glitters and disappears. The other class begins and grows and becomes forever. Already I see an early old age creeping over faces that were yesterday rosebuds, because they aimed to seem. I see again the divinity of hope and power beaming out of eyes that never sparkled with gratified vanity. The young preacher preached from his ears and his memory, and never a word from his soul. His sermon was loud and hollow. It was not the report so much as the rimbobo, the reverberation of Calvinism. A solemn conclusion of a Calvinistic discourse imitated at the end of a Unitarian sermon is surely ludicrous, like grandfather's hat and spectacles on a rogue of 6 years. Alas, I could not help thinking of how few prophets are left. There are 5 or 6 seers and sayers in the land. All the rest of the preaching is the reverberation of theirs. The young man relying on his instincts, who has only a good intention, is apt to feel ashamed of his inaction and the slightness of his virtue, when in the presence of the active and zealous leaders of the philanthropic enterprises of universal temperance, peace, abolition of slavery. He only loves like Cordelia after his duty, trusted nevertheless. A man's income is not sufficient for all things. If he spends here, he must save there. If he choose to build a solid hearth, he must postpone painting his house. Let each follow his taste, but let him not that loves fine porticos and avenues reprove him that chooses to have all weather tight and solid within. It is a grandeur of character which must have unity, and reviews and pries ever into its domestic truth and justice, loving quiet honor better than a proclaiming zeal. I think the zealot goes abroad from ignorance of the riches of his home. But this good intention, which seems so cheap beside this brave zeal, is the backbone of the world. When the trumpeters and heralds have been scattered, it is this which must bear the brunt of the fight. This is the martible stuff. Let it, for God's sake, grow free and wild, under wind, under sun, to be solid heart of oak and last forever. Every day is new. Every glance I throw upon nature ought to bring me new information. The gains of each day ought to bestow a new vision on tomorrow's eyes, a new melody on tomorrow's ears. It is very shallow to think the world full of vice, because the conventions of society are little worth. Henry and James and Jane and Anna are generous, tender-hearted, and of scrupulous conscience, whilst they are entirely immersed in these poor forms and conventions. Only they are not critical. They may make very great growth, too, before they shall become critical. By and by, that unfolding must be also, and then they will snap asunder the social cords like green withes. Lydian grieves aloud about the wretched Negro and the horrors of the Middle Passage, and they are bad enough. The horrors of the Middle Passage are the rends and ulcers that admonish us that a violation of nature has proceeded. I should not, the nations would not, know of the extremity of the wrong, but for the terrors of the retribution. October 2nd. My classmate Turnbull said of some praised belle that he had seen her on a certain day and did not think her handsome. Godine replied that it was a rainy day and she was not well dressed. Turnbull insisted that was fudge, that beauty was that which looked well wet days and dry in silks or flannel. Whatsoever the mind doth or saith is after a law. Hence the most random word can be said in a place by a philosopher. Why then should we think it strange that critics of today should find wonderful, ideal truth in Shakespeare's Tempest, or much more in the Homeric mythology? I must think that every analogical hint is to our science precious, however odious at first sight its tendency may be. Knowledge is undoubtedly lodged in the affinity betwixt man and ape, in equivocal generation. I have read the second volume of Bancroft's History of the United States. It is very pleasing. He does not, I think, ever originate his views, but he imports very good views into his book and parades his facts by the brave light of his principles. A very pleasant book for here, lo. The huge world has at last come round to Roger Williams, George Fox, and William Penn, and time-honored John Locke received kicks. An objection to the book is the insertion of a boyish hurrah every now and then for each state in turn, which resembles the fortune of the good professor in mathematics in a Southern college, who was not permitted to go on with his exercise on election day without interposing in his demonstration ABF equals GHI, hurrah for Jackson, and so on. One would think the right use of words is almost lost who reads such a sentence as that of Lord Jeffreys to Richard Baxter and compares it with our Latinized formulas. Quote, Richard, thou art an old knave, thou hast written books enough to load a cart, every one as full of sedition as an egg is full of meat. I know thou hast a mighty party, and a great many of the brotherhood are waiting in corners to see what will become of their mighty Don. But by the grace of Almighty God, I'll crush you all. Bancroft, Volume 2, page 441. The pagan theology of our churches treats heaven as an inevitable evil, which, as there is no help against, the best way is to put the best face on the matter we can. From whence, said the good preacher yesterday in his prayer, we shall not be able to return. Truth will out. We have vastly more kindness than is ever spoken. Maugre all the selfishness, the whole human family is bathed with an element of love like a fine ether. How many persons I meet in houses whom I scarcely speak to, who yet honor me and I them. How many I see in the street or sit with in the church, whom I warmly rejoice to be with. The heart knoweth. We owe much illustration of moral truth to such teaching as the composition of forces, which was also mechanically shown us in the college apparatus. Progress of the species. Every soul has to learn the whole lesson for itself. It must go over the whole ground. What it does not see, what it does not live, it will not know. What the former age has epitomized into a formula or rule for a manipular convenience, it will lose all the good of verifying for itself by means of the wall of that rule. Some time or other, somewhere or other, it will demand and find compensation for that loss by doing the work itself. How then, since each must go over every line of the ground, can there be any progress of the species? Ferguson discovered many things which had long been very well known. The better for him that he did not know. Is it not a reason and a topic for discoursing that the soul is not admired? Let me say with Plotinus, since therefore you admire soul in another thing, admire yourself. Admire the world and admire the more true world of which this is the image. October 3rd. The very naming of a subject by a man of genius is the beginning of insight. We do not love the man who gives us thoughts and conversation. We do not love that act. Why? Does it violate our thinking? Does it accuse our unthinking? We like the company of him whose manners or unconscious talk set our own minds in action, and we take occasions of rich opinions from him as we take apples off a tree without any thanks. How seldom we meet a man who gives us thoughts directly. It seems as if I could name all my benefactors, though I remember them as I do the lady who made me shirts. Say, Dr. G.B., A.B.A., M.M.E., C.C.E., H.H., G.P.B., O.D. And now that I name them, I see that what I have said is not true for these and needs much sharp qualification. But we feel towards a person who gives us beforehand what should be one of our thoughts, as we do to one who insists on telling us a conundrum we had all but guessed. He has defrauded us of a pleasant labor and a just honor. October 5th. I was glad to learn that the tree gets only 1/20th of its nourishment from the ground. The rest it drinks in by its aerial roots, the leaves from the air. The advantage of a tree-covered country over bald hills and fields in attracting electricity and rain was also alluded to in the most ridiculous discourse of yesterday's cattle show. Rest is only in principles. Keep the valve open and let them in. The conversation bobs up and down uneasy, immethodical, unsatisfying, heartless, until at last someone opens the soul to it. Then the waters without mix with the great deep, and equilibrium and peace ensue. As long as you name persons, there can be parties. When you speak of the human soul, there can be none. I gladly see in the last Foreign Quarterly Review the same doctrine preached in reference to architecture which I preach in literature and life. The list of ships' names in the newspaper is worth considering. Like the moon, the sea seems the refuge of things lost on earth. Fairy, Sylph, Neptune, Britomart, Ivanhoe, Rob Roy. A great man must always be willing to be little. Captain Pitts was the most important person, by his own account, of any in the world. No man had ever the advantage of him, but the speculative man has not the temper of the world's man, and his voice becomes husky and his eyes look down as the conversation wakens the partisan in him. Instantly the changed tone alters the tone of the other speakers, invites attack, scrutiny, lowers their respect, and throws him at once into a new position where he can no longer fight at arm's length, but must fight hand to hand with dirk and short sword. Then he has a chance to learn something. Then his memory serves him no longer. Now he has put on his wits, on his manhood. If he is defeated, all the better. He has gained facts, knowledge of himself, of his ignorance, of the strength of others, is cured of some insanity of conceit, and got some moderation and real skill in defense instead. Never sit on the cushion of your advantages. Do not, like a coward, fly to sanctuary either of place, profession, or manners at the first onset. You must pay dearly for the momentary shelter. Thereby you set a seal and put under lock and key your acquisitions thus far, and enroll yourself emeritus, and forego the prerogative of humanity of using your acquisitions as seed wheat, and of acquiring the all. Go rather and court defeat, mortification, and disgrace. Nothing venture, nothing have. You might as well expect the cannon on the north side of a fort to fire also south and east, as look for victory from the same man in every crisis. There is a time when common sense is impertinent, for foresight and philosophy are wanted. A time when arithmetic is vain, for wit and imagination are in request. A time when arithmetic is vain, for wit and imagination are in request. A time when philosophy and imagination are absurd, for one must act, count, measure, plunge, strike, and die. I suppose there was seldom a person of my age and advantages whom so little people could pull down and overthrow. The least people do most entirely demolish me. I almost find some quarter and some orts of respect from the mediocre, but a snipper-snapper eats me whole. There is no activity but accomplishes somewhat. A man is sometimes offended at the superfluous supererogatory order of a nicety of a woman, who is the good housewife. But he must bear with little extremities and flourishes of a quality that makes comfort for all his senses throughout his house. He must look at his virtue whole, and not only at the skirt of its garment, where it gathers up a little dust. In the days in which there is no vision, we learn that instructive negative. There are other advantages to be won besides money in the trading of every man. I covet the genuine conversation of my workmen. Where money is the main object in view, it is the least thing gained in the transaction. October 6th. A great man must not grumble at his contemporaries. God saith to him what the poet said, "The piece you say is incorrect. Why, take it. I'm all submission. What you'd have it, make it." If you don't like the world, make it to suit you. All true men have done so before you. Mr. Alston heroically says, his art must be sufficient to the artist, but the blanks grumble like sick women. I wonder at the interest that animal magnetism inspires in fine persons, not at all that it startles the thoughtless. I feel no strong interest in it. I do not doubt the wonder, but there is wonder enough in my thumbnail already. Its phenomena belong to the copious chapter of demonology, under which the category I suppose everybody's experience might write a few facts. These obscure facts are only to suggest that our being is richer than we knew, and we are now only in the forecourt or portico. The hints we have, the dreams, the coincidences do make each man stare once or twice in a lifetime. But animal magnetism seems the phenomena of disease, and too fuliginous and typhoid in their character to attract any but the physician. Animal magnetism is the shovel put under the feet to show how poor our foundations are. October 8th. Last evening I had a good hour with Mrs. Ripley. The young Southerner comes here a spoiled child with graceful manners, excellent self-command, very good to be spoiled more, but good for nothing else, a mere parader. He has conversed so much with rifles, horses, and dogs that he has become himself a rifle, a horse, and a dog, and in civil educated company, where anything human is going forward, he is dumb and unhappy, like an Indian in a church. Treat them with great deference, as we often do, and they accept it all as their due without misgiving. Give them an inch, and they take a mile. They are mere bladders of conceit. Each snipper-snapper of them all undertakes to speak for the entire Southern States. Quote, "At the South, the reputation of Cambridge," etc., etc., which being interpreted is, "In my Negro village of Tuscaloosa or Cheraw or St. Mark's, I suppose so and so." Quote, "We at the South," forsooth. They are more civilized than the Seminoles, however, in my opinion, a little more. Their question respecting any man's is like a Seminole's. How can he fight? In this country we ask, what can he do? His pugnacity is all they prize in man, dog, or turkey. The proper way of treating them is not deference, but to say, as Mr. Ripley does, fiddle-faddle, in answer to each solemn remark about the South. Quote, "It must be confessed," said the young man, "that in Alabama we are dead to everything as respects politics." "Very true," replied Mr. Ripley, leaving out the last clause. I scarce ever see young women who are not remarkably attractive without a wish, an impulse to preach to them the doctrine of character. I have sad foresight of the mortifications that await them when I see what they look on. Could once their eye be turned on the beauty of being, as it outshines the beauty of seeming, they would be saved. How is a man wise? By the perception of a principle. The immortality is as legitimately preached from the intellections as from the moral volitions. A coat. A good coat is always respected, they say, in the stagecoach. Good reason. A good coat stands for something, implies a small history. It shows that the wearer had some kind of a coat before, probably a good one, and will have another when this is worn out. It shows that the wearer lives among people who wear good coats. Besides, a man's coat money is usually only a small proportion to his food, and fire, and house, and traveling money, and by the outlay he can afford in the coat, we infer what outlay he can make in all. I maintain that all melancholy belongs to the exterior of man. I claim to be a part of the all. All exterior life declares interior life. I could not be, but that absolute life circulated in me, and I could not think this without being that absolute life. The constant warfare in each heart is betwixt reason and commodity. The victory is won as soon as any soul has learned always to take sides with reason against himself, to transfer his me from his person, his name, his interests, back upon truth and justice, so that when he is disgraced and defeated and fretted and disheartened and wasted by nothings, he bears it well, never one instant relaxing his watchfulness, and as soon as he can get a respite from the insults or the sadness, records all these phenomena, pierces their beauty as phenomena, and like a god oversees himself. Thus he harvests his losses and turns the dust of his shoes to gems. Keep the habit of the observer, and, as fast as you can, break off your association with your personality and identify yourself with the universe. Be a football to time and chance. The more kicks, the better, so that you inspect the whole game and know its uttermost law. As true is this ethics for trivial as for calamitous days. It is better to hear than to speak. Let me add of the winning loser described above, that a wise man will come to see the truth and wit of all the censures he received during his nonage, and to apply the very same with better wit and skill to the same faults as they reappear elsewhere, like the defenders of a besieged town who gather up the dead balls that have been discharged at them and launch them at the enemy. We are carried by destiny along our life's course, looking as grave and knowing as little as the infant who is carried in his wicker coach through the street. October 12th. Woman. From Kalidas's Meghaduta, translated by Professor Wilson. There in the fane a beauteous creature stands, the first, best work of the Creator's hands, whose slender limbs inadequately bear a full-orbed bosom and a weight of care, whose teeth like pearls, whose lips like cherries show, and fawn-like eyes still tremble as they glow. Asiatic Journal, August 1837. The words entered not the grieving heart, but returned to him that spoke them. Quote, He that taketh off weights advantageth motion as much as he that addeth wings, said Pym when he proposed to remove grievances before granting subsidies. Quote, Principle is a passion for truth, Hazlitt. Quote, It is not permitted to a man to corrupt himself for the sake of mankind, Rousseau. October 13th. With much to say, I put off writing until perhaps I shall have nothing in my memory. Now too soon, then too late. I must try the pen and make a beginning. At Boston, Thursday, I found myself nearly alone in the Athenaeum, and so dropped my book to gaze at the Laocoon. The main figure is great. The two youths work harmoniously on the eye, producing great admiration so long as the eye is directed at the old man. But look at them, and they are slight and unaffecting statues. No miniature copy and no single busts can do justice to this work. Its mass and its integrity are essential. At the Athenaeum you cannot see it unless the room is nearly empty, for you must stand at the distance of nearly the whole hall to see it, and interposing bystanders eclipse the statue. How is time abolished by the delight I have in this old work, and without a name I receive it as a gift from the universal mind. Then I read with great content the August number of the Asiatic Journal. Herein is always the piquancy of the meeting of civilization and barbarism. Calcutta or Canton are twilights where night and day contend. A very good paper is the narrative of Lord Napier's mission to China, who arrived at Macau 15th July 1834 and died 11th October. There stand in close contrast the brief, wise English despatches with mountainous nonsense of the Chinese diplomacy, the quote-unquote red permit writ by the vermilion pencil of the emperor, the super-African ignorance with which England is disdained as out of the bounds of civilization, and her king called reverently submissive, etc., etc. There is no farce in fiction better than this historical one of John Bull and the Yellow Man, albeit it ends tragically as Lord Napier died of vexation, apparently. I must get that book again. Then I read an ascent of the Himalaya mounts, and the terror of the cold, and the river seen bursting through caves of snow, and the traveler finding all over the desolate mountains bears' dung. Then a duel, pistols for two, and coffee for the survivor. Then an escape from a tiger and a canebrake. Then, thinking of the trees which draw out the air, their food by their aerial roots, the leaves, I mused on the strange versatility of the mind's appetite and food. Here were in the reading room some 4 or 5 men besides me, feeding on newspapers and journals, unfolding our being thereby. Secluded from war, from trade, and from tillage, we were making amends to ourselves by devouring the descriptions of these things, and atoning for the thinness by the quantity of our fare. Yet I read with joy the life of Hampden, Pym, or Penn, of men conversant with governments and revolutions, and dilate in the swelling scene. Is not the delight I there find an intimation that not always in speculation, not always by the poetic imagination alone, Shall the scholar, the private soul, be great, but one day in action also? When private men shall act with vast views, the luster will be transferred from the actions of kings to those of gentlemen. It made my heart beat quicker to think that the gorgeous pictures which fill my imagination in reading the actions of Hampden, Pym, Falkland, are only a revelation to me how needlessly mean our life is, that we by the depth of our living should deck it with more than regal or national splendor. Very coarse, very abhorrent to the imagination is the American White House, because it has no historic luster and natural growth out of feudalism, etc., like theirs, and is not, on the other hand, a new creation out of the soul, out of the virtue and truth outshining theirs, but is an imitation of their gaudiness, like a negro gay with cast-off epaulets and gold-laced hat of his master. Expression. How few lines tell the complex a story. A man whose coat has lost the haunch button, a man with a ragged coat, a man with a good coat. A neck is a neck, we say, but the limner knows better, knows that if the pencil swerve this way, it draws a beast, if that way, a god. The addition of a little capacity of attention would change a fool into a Shakespeare. Do manners tell no story? Did you ever see a poor child to whom if you offered a piece of cake it would grab it with a scream and put it behind its back, as a Broad Street child will do? New eyes. What is appears. Go out to walk with a painter, and you shall see for the first time groups, colors, clouds, and keepings, and shall have the pleasure of discovering resources in a hitherto barren ground, of finding as good as a new sense in such skill, to use an old one. Gentilhomme Bourgeois was really right in being glad to know that he was talking prose. When the telescope turns on our own barn and chimney, we like the new old sight better than the finest foreign turrets. October 15th. Mr. Horace says he would not give 1 cent for the effect upon a jury of a lawyer who does not believe in his heart that his client ought to have a verdict. October 16th. Scholastic fancies which I account to be at least as good as those of my financial fathers, whom I encountered in solemn session in the bank parlor. I was caught by the name of Fuller's Worthies of England, and tempted, like some great Columbus or Ledyard, instantly to get to horse and travel to Cambridge Library and spend a day with Fuller. The same emotions take different directions, and of course clothe themselves at last in strangest varied acts, as the same drop that fell on the ridge of Mount Washington goes half to New York and half to Canada. Tombs. The grandeur of England, the sepulchral monuments of old families came up in my imagination as I read Ben Jonson. Those marble scrolls and heraldic pomps that, so cold and dim, deck the tombs in churches, were not meant to project on the eye like the blue slate stone of John Crosby, which yesterday I saw outside of Billerica graveyard. Their office is, not to shine as a rocket, but to be aloof, a faint departing vision to fill up as tassel or fringe the hollow places of the memory of the name they bear. It is well to study the necessary cause of the marble tomb in the religion and culture of the society. The Roman Church built tombs, the theology of the verse I have copied above, was saving of the dust. A philosophic period would build everything but tombs. The babe stands alone today for the first time. In history our imagination makes fools of us, plays us false. Why all this deference to Sidney and Hampden? Culture inspects our dreams also. The pictures of the night will always bear some proportion to the visions of the day. I looked over the few books in the young clergyman's study yesterday till I shivered with cold. Priestley, Noyes, Rosenmuller, Joseph Allen, and other Sunday school books, Schlauner, Norton, and the Saturday Night of Taylor. The dirty comfort of the farmer could easily seem preferable to the elegant poverty of the young clergyman. The great poets are content with truth. They use the positive degree. They seem frigid and phlegmatic to those who have been spiced with a frantic passion, and violent coloring of the modern Byrons and Jimenzes and Shelleys, but it is like taking a walk or drinking cold water to the simple who read them. Such as Ben Jonson, whose epistles to Waugh and others, and Penhurst, and a Masque in Vol.3 of Nature and Prometheus, etc., I read this month. I call this their humanity. A lovely afternoon I went to Walden Water and read Goethe on the bank. In the present moment all the past is ever represented. The strong roots of ancient trees still bind the soil. The provincial literature is not obsolete for me, for I have read Spenser's Faery Queen to read, and all that faded splendor revives again in him for some centuries yet. Nor will Homer or Sophocles let me go, though I read them not, for they have formed those whom I read. Nor will the Egyptian designer die to me, my chair and tables forget him not. Time is the principle of levity, dissipating solidest things like exaltations. The monasteries of the Middle Ages were builded of timber, brick, and stone. So were the temples of Jove and those of Osiris, yet they dance now before me, late come into their globe, like words or less. October 18th. Custom is the Circe whose cup makes fool and beast of us. Would you know how abhorrent to all right reason is war? See what horrid spectres it creates, when it locks up the beauty of man in one of those brass or iron lobsters that we so wisely admire in the Tower of London. Every man is weak himself, but strong in relation to others. I am willing to know in my bosom these palpitations for a time, that I may learn their law. One of the last secrets we learn as scholars is to confide in our own impressions of a book. If Aeschylus is that man he is taken for, he has not yet done his office when he has educated the learned of Europe for 1,000 years. He is now to approve himself a master of delight to me. If he cannot do that, all his fame shall avail him nothing. I were a fool not to sacrifice 1,000 Aeschyluses to my intellectual integrity. Skill in writing consists in making every word cover a thing. In the tragedies of Aeschylus, the thing is tragic, and all the fine names of gods and goddesses stand for something in the reader's mind. The human mind is impatient of falsehood, and drops all words that do not stand for verities. I went through the wood to Sleepy Hollow, and sat down to hear the harmless roarings of the sunny south wind. Into the narrow throat of the vale flew dust and leaves from the fields, and straggling leaves mounted and mounted to great heights. The shining boughs of the trees in the sun, the swift sailing clouds, and the warm air made me think a man is a fool to be mean and unhappy when every day is made illustrious by these splendid shows. If nature relented at all from her transcending laws, if there were any traces in the daily obituary that the yellow-fevered spared this doctor or that Sunday school teacher, if any sign that a good man was governing, we should lose all our confidence, the world all its sublimity. This is the end of Part 4 of Emerson's journal collection number 28. In the following video, we will continue with journal collection number 28, starting on the date October 19th. Thank you for listening.